Well, the primary role, of course, is to make sure that people in retirement have got the maximum financial security and the best lifestyle possible. If along the way we can help in the development of infrastructure and other investments, then that's fine. But we mustn't lose sight of our primary purpose, which is to make sure that people have a long, healthy and financially stable retirement.
I think one of the key issues with, from a government's perspective, and then infrastructure in Australia in particular, is the need to work with industry and work with organisations such as IFM to ensure that we develop appropriate programs so that we can fund them, both that we can develop product with the government and allow superannuation funds to invest in them appropriately.
I mean, I think superannuation as a long-term investor is the natural partner in big nation-building projects, but the government obviously needs to come to the party. A lot of these things won't make sense without the government providing a regulatory framework, because a lot of them are completely new projects. It's not like laws exist around, you know, as Garry Weaven has mentioned, you know, drawing geothermal power from the Cooper Basin in South Australia and connecting it with the eastern seaboard power grid. The only way that's going to be made commercial for anybody to do is if successive state and the federal government get together and make sure that there's a market and make sure that there is an inbuilt demand for this stuff.
Good infrastructure projects can be profitable investments. That's the first thing to say. So by all means, if you've got the long-term capital sitting inside superannuation funds, it should be used to develop these long-term projects. It'll be good for the members of those superannuation funds ultimately. The other thing is the nation's infrastructure has got to be modern and efficient and working properly to underpin broader economic growth. So in other words, if you don't have the investment in the infrastructure, everything else eventually grinds to a halt, and I think we're starting to see a little bit of that coming through the system now. So you've got a double whammy. You've got the direct benefit of investing in the infrastructure, building, owning, operating and potentially selling the individual infrastructure projects, and then you've got the less direct economic benefits of having an efficient economy which is going to underpin growth.
Infrastructure assets are a natural investment for super funds. As you say, they are a long-term asset. In many cases, you can make reasonably accurate assessments of the likely income flow that comes from the infrastructure, and certainly you can see it very much as an asset which will deliver you a real return.
I'd like to see superannuation funds banding together to invest in big projects like wind farms and massive solar farms and things like that. It's possible to power Australia's baseload energy needs with a 50-kilometre square solar energy farm. Let's build it.
One of the things that CBUS does is invest back into the industry. We have, a reasonable property portfolio, and our members are really keen on that. They're really keen on the fact that we're investing back into the industry so that we can give them jobs.
The great water recycling revolution. It's what the rest of the world does, it's what South Australia does, it's what Australia should be doing. It means big infrastructure and it means big investment, and that's of importance to super funds.
When you look at infrastructure as one of the alternative type investments that funds are looking at, I think it clearly falls into that bucket.
The politician used to say, we've got an election coming up soon, I feel a dam coming on. No politician these days are going to even contemplate a dam coming on.
Infrastructure can offer some very attractive characteristics for investors.
The sole purpose test doesn't rule out your ability to do good things.
Diversification is key to maximising returns, especially now we've all seen the investment benefits of infrastructure assets such as airports and roads. As we become more aware of sustainability, climate change, pollution and other environmental issues, funds are identifying new infrastructure opportunities and factoring them into the investment process. You've seen the people in this clip agree that wind, solar, geothermal energy and solutions for efficient water management are perfect investment partners for super. But for these projects to help build the nation, they'll need government buy-in.
My name is Andrew Whiley, and I'd like to welcome you all to this number 2 plenary session at CMSF to build a nation. I think looking both at the presentation and the publicity that's been surrounding this question of infrastructure, that we'd have to recognise that decades of disinvestment, debt aversion and plain old dithering by governments at a state and federal level have got us to the point where we are today, where the nation is straining at the seams to meet the demands being placed upon it. This issue of not only infrastructure but investment by super funds in infrastructure has long been on the agenda in the not-for-profit sector. It's been a part of what many industry funds have done in pioneering investment in alternative assets and infrastructure themselves, and it's now where it should be, front and centre in the nation's mind. On top of that, climate change and all the effects that go with that mean that we can't just keep building more of the same. There is a criteria now of efficiency, adaptation, mitigation and sustainability in general that's going to be overlaid against any ideas for future infrastructure investments, and are going to mean a further change in how we look at what has to be done. The change of government has seen some emerging developments. There is now a Minister for Infrastructure. There's been the creation of Infrastructure Australia, a statutory body to help coordinate and look at these issues, and we'll all wait and see whether that can drive through some of the necessary changes that are needed in our society and in the country as a whole. We can't cover all of the gamut of issues associated with infrastructure today. There are too many, but we are able to put 4 speakers in front of you dealing with energy, housing, water and, via Garry, the big I, infrastructure in general. We've put this session together on the basis of extended time for audience participation and questions, so you will have an opportunity to participate directly in some discussion and some debate and clarify some of the points that are going to be made. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker today, and many of you will know him from previous presentations at CMSF, ASI and other industry forums. Frank Muller is a visiting professorial fellow at the Institute of Environmental Studies and Climate Change Research Centre at the University of New South Wales. He lectures, he writes, he advises governments and business on climate change and sustainable development policy. He's had a 32-year career in environmental, energy and land use policy in both Australia and the United States, playing a key role with government and universities, acting as a private consultant and providing support and advice to the community sector. I'd like you all to join me in welcoming Frank as our first speaker today.
Thank you, Andrew. I want to discuss a key part of our energy infrastructure, the electricity industry. And please bear with me though, I'm not going to give you the conventional story. The threat of dangerous climate change presents a huge challenge to our society, and nowhere is this more evident than in the electricity sector. New thinking is essential if we are to find a way forward that satisfies our economic, social and environmental goals. So in that vein, let's start with some home truths that are often overlooked. Electricity is a means to other ends, not an end in itself. No one needs kilowatt hours per se. We need the services that are provided when electricity is used in a diverse range of equipment and buildings. Services like comfort, ventilation, lighting, communications and motive power. What we are now learning is that in many cases we can get the same or even better services with a lot less kilowatt hours, and that doing so can actually save us money. Our politicians talk a lot about electricity prices, but what really matters is electricity bills. Prices are likely to rise, but if we make the investments needed to use electricity more efficiently, then bills can come down. There is an emerging consensus among scientists and policymakers that allowing the Earth to warm by more than about 2 degrees Celsius would be too risky. Even less than 2 degrees poses risks that many of us would consider unacceptable, like loss of the Great Barrier Reef. But urgent action is required if we're to have any chance of staying below 2 degrees. One widely cited scenario suggests global emissions would have to peak by around 2015 and then fall by as much as 85% by mid-century. High-emitting rich countries like Australia would have to make earlier and deeper cuts for the international community to take this path. Cutting greenhouse emissions increasingly will be the most important driver of electricity infrastructure decisions. Electricity generation is responsible for more than a third of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions, and these emissions grew by 50% between 1990 and 2005. This cannot continue. Numerous recent studies have found that improving energy efficiency provides the cheapest and largest near to medium-term opportunities for reducing emissions. Globally, for example, McKinsey Global Institute finds that energy demand growth can be cut in half or more over the next 15 years. And they only consider using existing technologies and profitable investments having an internal rate of return of 10% or more. It is a story that is being played out in California, where per capita electricity use has remained flat over the past 3 decades, due in part to state-level energy efficiency policies and regulations. And California's economy has grown strongly. Examples of opportunities to reduce electricity demand through investments on the consumer side of the meter include lighting retrofits, upgraded heating, ventilation and air conditioning, building control systems, smarter appliances and electronics, and gas or solar water heating. In many cases, these are investments that can both reduce emissions and generate a profit. It's what we call negative cost greenhouse abatement, but they don't happen because of how our energy system is organised, and a carbon price alone won't make them happen. These opportunities suggest that our electricity industry is not only environmentally problematic, but also economically inefficient. The most urgent energy infrastructure challenge for Australia today is on the demand side. There are problems on the supply side, but the demand side is the most urgent challenge. We need to start thinking differently about energy, recognising, for example, that our electricity infrastructure is one whole physically interconnected system that runs all the way from those big Hunter and Latrobe Valley power plants through to the air conditioners in our homes, the electric motors in our factories, and the lights of commercial buildings. We also need to view this infrastructure not just as a radial system centred on big coal power plants, but as a network that increasingly includes distributed generation like wind farms, biomass plants using sugar wastes, and gas-fired systems providing both heat and power to factories and commercial buildings. Our energy policies, our energy utilities, and much of the energy analysis undertaken by agencies and consultants are heavily oriented to big supply-side projects. Investment is preferentially funneled into expanding supply without any serious consideration of whether or not lower cost opportunities are available to reduce demand. This is evident in the current push for new baseload coal-fired generation in New South Wales. There have been 2 main kinds of efforts to date by Australian governments to improve energy efficiency. Various state-level codes, regulatory initiatives, dedicated funds and one-off projects have channelled some dollars into demand management. While providing important learning, these efforts remain a pimple on the supply-side pumpkin. They have not changed the main game. Then there are national and state-level standards for buildings and appliances, now to be strengthened and expanded with the change of government in Canberra. Such standards serve the important role of cutting worst practice energy waste out of the market, but we also need to drive investment into best practice and foster continuous improvement. To unleash the economic and environmental potential of energy efficiency, we need to transform the electricity industry. Energy retailers, for example, rather than just selling kilowatt hours, the more the better, might become energy service companies that assist households and small businesses to better manage their demand. Remember those flyers that came with the bill promoting cheap, inefficient air conditioners? Imagine instead if retailers partnered with manufacturers or importers to aggressively market the most efficient refrigerators, perhaps with the option of paying the added cost through the quarterly power bill? Or how about a partnership between government, local manufacturers and energy retailers to dramatically expand the market and cut the cost of solar water heaters, displacing base load power demand? Or how about energy utilities partnering with property developers to finance state-of-the-art energy efficient housing estates and commercial buildings? More than $20 billion per annum is spent by customers in the national electricity market, and roughly 2/3 ends up with the network operators and 1/3 with the generators. How do we redirect some of this cash to improving energy efficiency? We need to take a good look at the underlying institutional framework to ensure it serves today's goal of least cost energy services rather than yesterday's goal of cheap kilowatt hours. Just piling programs and regulations on top of a market that inherently favours a supply-side approach is likely to prove costly and confusing as well as ineffective. Where can consumers get reliable information and advice on improving energy efficiency? What are the options for financing improvements? Can the existing retailers be transformed into energy service companies, or are they a barrier to reform? If the answers aren't obvious, how can policy foster experimentation and learning? Is there a role for public institutions, as there was when we first developed an electricity industry? While policymakers and the community debate these issues, there are some important initiatives that industry funds can take to position themselves for the future. First, some of the largest and most profitable opportunities to improve energy efficiency lie within the commercial building sector, where many funds have large holdings. A premium market is emerging for energy efficient buildings. Business tenants face growing pressure to disclose and reduce their carbon footprint. The most direct and credible response is to reduce energy use, and increasingly this will be the preferred strategy as carbon offsets attract the scrutiny of watchdogs and regulators. Funds might consider a pooled effort to develop high-level expertise in financing development of best practice new buildings and the upgrading of existing buildings. Not only can you gain commercial benefits in the expanding premium green building market and reduce your exposure to future carbon price hikes, what you learn and the capacities you develop in upgrading your own property portfolio can also provide a strong basis for new business opportunities, assisting others to do the same. The trailblazing efforts of industry fund services to keep Pacific Hydro as an Australian company show just how much of a difference you can make. Indeed, combining Pacific Hydro's capacity to generate high-quality renewable energy certificates with a new green building capacity would position you as a key player in the emerging low-carbon economy. Second, funds would be wise to develop a stronger risk management approach to investment in carbon-intensive supply side energy infrastructure. This should include a critical appraisal of the conventional view that energy demand must endlessly continue on an upwards path. The economics of large, lumpy power generation investments with long lead times, like coal plants, are founded on an endless demand growth paradigm. The recent McKinsey and other studies tell us that demand growth is no longer certain, even if it takes public policy to bring this change. In a world of uncertain demand, modular investments that can be brought to market quickly, such as gas-fired, renewable and demand-side projects, might provide a much more favourable risk-return profile. Notably, last month, 5 major Wall Street banks underscored the changing nature of investment risk in power generation by issuing a new set of guidelines for investors and advisors known as the Carbon Principles. The future for energy infrastructure is going to be very different. Industry funds can play a role in shaping that future to the benefit of both of your members and society at large. Thank you.